They didn't warn me. Nobody pulled me aside before the reception and said, "Hey, just so you know, Dad is going to say something tonight that will change everything." Nobody thought to do that. And maybe that's the part that still gets me, even now, not what he said, but the fact that everyone at that table already knew who he was, and not one of them thought I deserved a heads up. My brother got married on a Saturday in October, in a vineyard outside Charlottesville, Virginia. The leaves were turning. Everything was golden and expensive looking, the kind of wedding that gets posted on Pinterest before the couple even lands at their honeymoon destination. My brother had done well for himself. He'd married a woman named Claire, whose family owned 3 car dealerships in Northern Virginia, and from the moment he put that ring on her finger, my parents treated him like he had personally won the Nobel Prize. I was 26 years old. I had driven 4 hours from Charlotte, where I'd been living for 2 years, working as a paralegal, while I figured out what I actually wanted to do with my life. I wasn't lost, not really. I had a 1-bedroom apartment that I loved, a cat named Biscuit, 2 good friends, and a job that paid the bills with a little left over. I wasn't my brother. I wasn't getting married at a vineyard or buying a house in a suburb with a 3-car garage, but I was fine. I was genuinely fine. I told myself that on the drive up. I said it out loud, twice, somewhere around Danville. I am fine. I can do this. It's one weekend. I should have kept driving. The ceremony was beautiful. I'll give them that. Claire cried when she saw my brother at the end of the aisle. He cried too. A little. And I remember thinking that I had never seen him cry before in my entire life. Not once. Not even when our dog died when we were kids. I sat in the 3rd row, between my aunt from my mother's side and a cousin I barely knew. My parents were in the front row, obviously. My mother had on a dress the color of champagne, and she looked stunning, the way she always looks when there are other people around to see her. The reception was in a barn that had been converted into something out of a magazine. String lights everywhere, long wooden tables, a band that played Fleetwood Mac covers and did a surprisingly good job. I had 2 glasses of wine, and I ate the salmon, and I danced with my cousin for 1 song, and I thought, okay, I'm going to get through this. Maybe it'll even be nice. Then came the toasts. My mother went first. She talked about my brother as a little boy, how he used to line up his toy cars in perfect rows, how he always knew exactly what he wanted. She talked about Claire like she'd always been part of the family. She cried at the end, the pretty kind of crying where 1 tear rolls down 1 cheek and you look like a movie. Everyone applauded. Claire's mother was dabbing her eyes. Then my father stood up. My father is the kind of man who fills a room without trying. He's tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that lands in your chest when he speaks. He's charming in the way that certain men are charming effortlessly, and usually at someone else's expense. I had spent my entire childhood watching rooms fall in love with him. I had spent my entire childhood being one of the people he was charming at the expense of. He tapped his glass. He smiled. He looked at my brother and Claire at the head table, and he said all the right things for about 2 minutes. He talked about watching my brother become a man. He talked about being proud. He talked about knowing, from the time my brother was a teenager, that he was going to do something with his life. And then he paused. He looked out at the tables, and somehow, in a barn with 200 people, his eyes found mine. He said, "When you have kids, you hope they all turn out like this one." He laughed a little. People laughed with him. And then he said, "Our daughter is proof that they don't always." Silence. Then laughter again. Louder, because people were nervous, and they were following his lead, and he was still smiling, still holding his glass like it was a punchline, like I was a punchline, like I was a bit he'd been workshopping for years, and this wedding, this barn full of my brother's new in-laws and family friends and people I had never met before in my life, was the perfect venue to finally deliver it. I sat very still. I know I did because I remember exactly what it felt like, my hands in my lap, my spine straight, my face doing something that I hoped looked neutral. I remember the candle in front of me, a little tea light in a glass holder, and I stared at the flame while my father kept talking, transitioning smoothly into something about marriage and commitment, and the room settled back into warmth and applause. My aunt touched my arm. Not to comfort me, she was leaning over to reach the breadbasket. I excused myself about 30 seconds later. I walked to the bathroom at the back of the barn, and I stood at the sink and I ran cold water over my wrists, and I looked at myself in the mirror, and I made a decision. I was going to get through the rest of this night. I was going to smile, and eat the cake, and hug my brother, and drive back to Charlotte tomorrow morning, and I was never, ever coming back. I made it until about 11 o'clock. I found my mother near the bar, talking to Claire's aunt, and I waited until there was a break in the conversation, and then I pulled her a few steps away and I said, quietly, "Can you explain what Dad meant by that?" She looked at me like I had asked her to explain gravity. "He was joking," she said. "You always take everything so personally." He said it in front of 200 people. He was toasting your brother. It was supposed to be funny. It wasn't funny to me, she said. The kind of sigh that meant I was exhausting her. That this conversation was an inconvenience she hadn't budgeted for. She patted my arm once, the way you'd pat a surface to check if it was dry, and she said, "Don't make this about you tonight. Please. This is your brother's wedding." I drove back to the hotel by myself. I had a rental car, which turned out to be the only logistical decision I'd made correctly in the past 6 months. I sat in the parking lot for about 10 minutes without going inside, and then I called my best friend Diane back in Charlotte, and I told her what happened, and she said, "Come home. Tonight. Just come home." And I said I couldn't. I had breakfast with the family in the morning, and she said, "No, you don't. You really don't." I stayed for breakfast. I don't know why. Pride, maybe, or some leftover instinct about what a good daughter was supposed to do. My father was warm and normal at breakfast, the way he always was the morning after something like that, as if the night before had been a weather event that had passed through and was no longer anyone's problem. He asked about my drive up. He asked about my job. He called me kiddo twice. I answered in complete sentences. I ate my eggs. And then I got in the rental car, and I drove to Charlotte, and I cried for about 40 minutes on I-85, and then I stopped, and I didn't cry about it again for a long time. I called my brother once, about 2 weeks later. Not to complain, I wasn't even sure what I wanted, honestly. I think I just wanted him to say he'd noticed. That was all. I wasn't asking him to confront anyone, or cause a scene, or choose sides. I just wanted him to say, "I saw that, and I'm sorry it happened at my wedding." He said my dad hadn't meant anything by it. He said I knew how Dad was. He said Claire's family was still talking about what a great speech it was. I said okay. I said congratulations again. I said I was really happy for him. I hung up and I blocked his number. I blocked my parents too, both of them, on my phone and on everything else. I moved my contact information at work, so it was unlisted. It wasn't dramatic, or at least I didn't feel dramatic doing it. It felt like closing a window that had been letting cold air in for so long I'd forgotten what warm felt like. For the first few months, I waited to feel guilty. It never came. What came instead was quiet. A very specific, very unfamiliar quiet that settled into my apartment like a new piece of furniture I hadn't known I was missing. I woke up on Sunday mornings without dread. I went through entire holidays without that particular tightening in my chest that came from anticipating how the day would go wrong. I called Diane instead of my mother when I had good news. I let myself take up space in my own life in ways I hadn't fully realized I was holding back. I got promoted at the firm. I started taking night classes for my paralegal certification. I started running, badly, and then less badly. And then I ran a 10K in April, and I stood at the finish line with my hands over my head, and I cried in a completely different way than I'd cried on I-85 that October morning. Nobody from my family called. Nobody wrote. I had blocked them, yes, but I had an email address they knew, and I had a physical address in Charlotte that hadn't changed, and they knew where I worked because I had told them at the wedding. Nothing. 2 Christmases. My birthday. Nothing. That told me more than the toast ever had. My cousin Rachel was the one thread I kept. She was the one person from my family's orbit who had texted me 2 days after the wedding not to gossip or to play both sides, but to say, "I heard what he said. I'm so sorry. You didn't deserve that." I had stared at that text for a long time before I responded. It was the first time anyone in that room had said those words to me. Rachel and I had never been particularly close growing up, but we became close then. She lived in Richmond, and we started meeting halfway for lunch, usually in a town called Ashland that had a diner we both liked. We talked about a lot of things. We talked about my family less than you might think. She understood instinctively that I wasn't looking for analysis or advice. I was just looking to be known by someone who shared the history. It was Rachel who told me, about a year after the wedding, that my father had had a health scare. Something with his heart, nothing catastrophic, but enough that he'd spent a few days in the hospital. She told me not because she thought I should do anything about it, but because she thought I should know. I thanked her and I drove home, and I sat with it for a while. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. Or maybe what I was afraid I would feel. I didn't feel relief, exactly, but I didn't feel the pull toward the phone that I'd been half expecting either. I felt something more like distance, the recognition that whatever happened to them now was happening to them in a life that no longer intersected with mine. That probably sounds cold. I've thought about it a lot over the years, and I think it was just honest. I turned 31 that summer. I had been at the firm for 5 years by then, and I had finally gotten my certification, and I was starting to think about law school in a real way, not just in the late-night, what-if way. I had a different apartment, bigger, with a second bedroom I used as an office. Biscuit had been joined by a second cat, named Marlowe. I had a life that I had built from nothing but my own choices, and when I walked through it each morning, I felt the specific satisfaction of ownership that I think a lot of people raised the way I was raised spend years trying to find. And then one Tuesday in November, my email loaded, and I saw my mother's name. I almost closed the laptop. I sat there for a long time, maybe 5 minutes, just looking at the subject line, which said nothing, completely blank, and then I opened it. It was 4 sentences. She said she knew I probably wouldn't respond. She said there was something they needed to tell me in person, and that she was asking, not demanding, and that she would understand if I said no. She left a phone number I didn't recognize. She didn't say what the something was. I called Rachel that night. Rachel was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I think I know what it's about. I don't want to tell you secondhand. I think you should hear it from them." "Is someone dying?" I asked. "No," she said. "Not like that. But I think you should hear it from them." I went back and forth for 2 weeks. I made a list once, actual pen and paper, pros and cons, and then I felt ridiculous and threw it away. I talked to Diane, who said, "Whatever you decide, make sure you're doing it for you, and not because you feel like you're supposed to." I talked to my therapist, who said something similar but with more frameworks around it. In the end, I called the number. My mother answered on the second ring. She sounded older than I remembered. That was the first thing I noticed, not what she said, but the way her voice had changed in 5 years, like something had gone out of it. She thanked me for calling. She didn't cry, which surprised me. She asked how I was, and I gave her a short, honest answer. And then I waited. She told me that my brother and Claire were divorcing, that it had been in process for almost a year, that Claire's family had pulled back from mine in the way that families do in those situations, and that my parents had lost some friendships connected to that circle. She said my brother wasn't doing well. I said I was sorry to hear it. And then she said something I had not expected. She said, "Your father wants to talk to you. He asked me to ask you." I didn't say anything for a moment. She said, "He's not the same as he was. The heart thing scared him, and then the thing with your brother, I don't know. He's different. I'm not asking you to forgive anything, I'm just asking if you would be willing to listen." I thought about that barn in October, 5 years ago. I thought about the candle in the tea light and the sound of 200 people laughing. I thought about my mother's hand on my arm, and the word personally, and my brother telling me that Claire's family thought it was a great speech. I thought about the apartment in Charlotte with 2 cats, and the certification framed on the wall in my office, and the Sunday mornings without dread. I said, "I'm willing to hear what he has to say, but I'm not coming there. If he wants to talk to me, he can come here." There was a pause. She said, "Okay." My father drove to Charlotte on a Saturday in January. He came alone. I had told my mother that I wanted to meet him at a coffee shop, not my apartment. My apartment was mine, and I wasn't ready to share that geography yet. He was already there when I arrived, which surprised me. He was sitting at a corner table with a black coffee, and he looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically smaller, exactly, but something about him had contracted. The thing that used to fill the room was quieter. He stood when he saw me. I sat down across from him and I didn't order anything. He talked for a while. He said the things people say in those situations, that he'd been thinking about it, that he knew it wasn't right, that it had been eating at him. He didn't make excuses, which I had braced for, and the absence of them threw me slightly. He said he had thought it was funny, and that he had been wrong, and that he understood if that wasn't enough. I looked at him across the table, and I thought about what Diane had said, make sure you're doing it for you. I said, I'm not going to tell you it's okay, because it wasn't. And I'm not going to act like this conversation erases 5 years of silence, because it doesn't. He nodded. But, I said, I'm willing to try. Slowly. On my terms. He said he understood. He said he was grateful. He did not cry. My father has never cried in front of me in my life, but something crossed his face that was close enough to it that I looked away. I got a coffee after all. We talked for about an hour. About things that had nothing to do with any of this. My job, his health, a trip he and my mother were planning. It was careful and slow, like walking on ice that you're not sure will hold. At one point, he asked about my life in Charlotte, and I told him about the certification and the law school applications, and he said, "That's really something," and it landed differently than I expected. Not everything, not nearly. But something. He left around noon. I sat in the coffee shop for 20 more minutes after his car pulled out of the lot. The barista behind the counter was playing a playlist that had Fleetwood Mac on it, which felt like the universe making a joke. I thought about the woman who had driven back from Charlottesville 5 years ago, crying on the highway, calling Diane from a parking lot, blocking a number, and then sitting in the quiet waiting for guilt that never came. I thought about everything she had built in the absence of those people. None of that went away because of one conversation in a coffee shop. None of it became retroactively fine. The toast still happened. The silence still happened. My mother still said the word personally, and my brother still told me, Claire's family loved the speech. But I had driven to that coffee shop under my own power, from my own apartment, with a certification on my wall and 2 cats, and a law school application I was going to submit in February, and I had sat across from my father and told him exactly what I thought. And I had walked out on my own terms. That's not the ending where I forgive everything and the family pulls together, and we all learn something in the last 5 minutes. I know that's what some people want, the clean version, the one where it comes full circle and everybody cries and the music swells, but that's not what I had. What I had was a coffee shop in Charlotte, and a father who drove 4 hours to sit across from a daughter who no longer needed his approval to know she was worth something. What I had was the understanding that he could want to do better without that obligating me to hand back everything I had taken 5 years to build. I submitted my law school application on a Tuesday in February. Rachel was the first person I told. She sent back 3 exclamation points and a voice memo of herself yelling in her car, which I've kept. My mother texted me on my birthday that year, for the first time in 5 years. It was a short text. It just said happy birthday, and that she was proud of me. I looked at it for a long time. I didn't respond that day. I thought about it, weighed it, turned it over, and then the next morning I typed back 2 words. Thank you. Not because everything was resolved. Not because the barn in Charlottesville had been unbuilt, or the laughter had been unlaughed, or the 5 years of silence had filled themselves back in, but because I decided to. Because it was my choice to make, and for the first time in my life, that felt like exactly what it was. I am not my father's punchline. I never was. It just took me a while, and then 5 years, and then one Saturday in January, to stop waiting for him to be the one who said it.